Minutes right after my divorce was finalized, I called my dad. Fire all 27 employees my in-laws planted in the company. Thank God I did, because that same evening, my MIL came over yelling, demanding me to give them their jobs back. My hands were shaking when I dialed him, standing on the courthouse steps in a gray blazer that still smelled faintly of the cedar closet I'd hung it in for years. My voice wasn't shaking, though. That surprised me more than anything else that morning. Lock out all 27 employees my in-laws planted in the company, I said. Right now. There was a pause on the line long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then my dad said, say that again. I said it again. By sunset that day, every account tied to those 27 names had been frozen. I want to tell you it felt like a victory, but mostly it felt like standing at the edge of a building I'd spent years pretending was solid ground. That night, my mother-in-law showed up at my house, pounding on the door hard enough that I heard my neighbor's porch light click on through the wall. She wasn't there to plead for anyone's job, not really. She was there to find out how much I knew, and more specifically, whether I'd found the 28th name. But I'm getting ahead of things. To understand why I made that call from the courthouse steps instead of waiting even one more day, you have to go back 8 years, to a version of me who thought marrying into that family meant gaining something instead of slowly losing it. I was 28 when I married the man who would become my husband. I'd just been promoted at my father's company, a steel manufacturing business he'd built from one rented warehouse and a truck he bought used in his 20s. My dad was the kind of man who still drank his coffee out of a chipped blue mug he'd owned since before I could talk. He knew the name of every foreman on the floor. He knew their kids' names too, and usually whether those kids were struggling in school or thriving in it. On my 30th birthday, 2 years into the marriage, he handed me a folder of documents that gave me 25% ownership of the company. Then he handed me a gray blazer, the same one I wore on the courthouse steps years later. You wear this when you're ready to lead, he told me. I laughed and said I wasn't anywhere near ready. He looked at me over the rim of that mug like he was measuring something. You will be. My husband loved that story. Or at least I believed he did back when I still took most things about him at face value. In the early years, he used to stand behind me while I got dressed for work, smoothing down the shoulders of my blazers, telling me I looked like someone people would trust with their money and their futures. That kind of attention felt like safety. I didn't examine it much beyond that. When you've spent your whole adult life trying to prove you belong somewhere and someone hands you that feeling without asking anything in return, you don't stop to check the fine print. His mother was a different kind of person entirely, though it took me years to understand just how different. She never asked for anything directly. Direct requests, I'd learn, were beneath her. What she did instead, at our very first Thanksgiving as a married couple, was pass me a bowl of sweet potatoes, smile in that warm, grandmotherly way she'd perfected, and mention that my husband's cousin had recently been laid off. He's wonderful with numbers, she said, like she was offering me a gift instead of a request. It would be such a blessing if family could help family. I wanted her to like me. That was the truth underneath everything that came after. I wanted my husband's family to see me as generous, as someone who understood what family was supposed to mean, because my own understanding of family had always felt a little precarious, a little like something I had to keep earning. So I made a call. I arranged an interview. The cousin started in purchasing a few months later, and my mother-in-law thanked me with a hug that lasted just a beat too long, like she was sealing something. After the cousin, it was a relative on my mother-in-law's side with logistics experience, or so she said, then someone for payroll, then someone for internal controls, the department that was supposed to catch exactly this kind of pattern before it became a pattern at all. Each request arrived wrapped in a sad story, a compliment, or a gentle reminder that successful families were supposed to lift others up. None of them seemed dangerous in isolation. That was the design of it, though I didn't have the language for that yet. My husband always called it kindness. My father trusted my recommendations because he trusted me completely, the way he'd trusted me since I was a kid riding along in his truck to job sites on weekends. I trusted my husband because I loved him, and my mother-in-law understood, with an almost surgical precision, exactly how to move through the space between those two forms of trust without either of us noticing the door she was walking through. By the time I turned 35, her people were scattered across every department that touched money, contracts, shipping, or oversight. I want to be honest about something here. I noticed the pattern before I let myself see it clearly. There's a difference between those two things that I didn't understand until much later. Noticing is passive. Seeing requires you to admit what the pattern means, and admitting that meant admitting something about my marriage I wasn't ready to face. One evening, I stayed late reviewing staffing costs, the factory floor gone quiet except for the hum of the ventilation system and the metallic ticking of cooling equipment settling for the night. I traced the names on the employee list with my finger, one after another. Cousin, in-law, family friend, former neighbor, 27 connections in total, though I didn't have the full count yet at that point. It didn't look like generosity to me anymore. Sitting there in the quiet, it looked like placement, like pieces set on a board by someone who'd been playing a much longer game than I had. The first real warning was small enough that I almost let it slide past me entirely. A supplier bill came in for storage costs nearly double what we'd paid the previous year. When I brought it up with the cousin, he slid a printed cost comparison across my desk without hesitation, like he'd been waiting for the question. Fuel costs had changed everything, he said. The numbers looked clean. Too clean, in the way that things look clean when someone has had time to prepare them in advance. A week later, one of our largest customers called to complain that a steel shipment had arrived 3 days late. The logistics relative blamed bad weather along the shipping route. I checked. The sky had been clear the entire week, not a cloud in any of the cities the shipment passed through. Then I found consulting payments with no visible work attached to them. Bills split into amounts small enough to avoid a second layer of approval. Vendor contracts that, when I traced traced them back far enough, kept circling to businesses connected to my mother-in-law, sometimes through a name, sometimes through an address that matched a property I knew belonged to her. Every time I raised a question, my husband had an answer ready before I'd even finished asking it. That should have told me something on its own. Answers that fast don't come from people who are hearing a concern for the first time. One night, I spread copies of everything across our kitchen table while the dishwasher hummed behind us, the same dishwasher we'd registered for as a wedding gift 3 years earlier. Something is wrong, I said, not looking up from the papers. My husband came around the table, rubbed my shoulders the way he always did, and lowered his voice into the register he used when he wanted me to start doubting myself. I recognize that register now, looking back, though I couldn't name it at the time. You're exhausted, he said. You're seeing patterns because you're looking too hard. I'm looking because money is disappearing. He pulled his hands away from my shoulders. Do you hear yourself? These are people we know. By the end of that conversation, I was the one apologizing. That became our pattern, repeated so many times over the following months that I could have written the script for either of us. I'd find a problem. My husband would soften his voice and redirect the conversation toward my exhaustion, my paranoia, my tendency to overanalyze. My mother-in-law would call the next day with some story about loyalty or gratitude or how hurt some relative had been by my questions, and I would back down every single time to keep whatever peace I thought we still had. But the delays kept getting worse. Vendor costs climbed steadily even when market prices held flat across the industry. Longtime employees, people who'd worked the floor for 15 or 20 years, were quietly passed over for promotions, while my mother-in-law's relatives moved into positions that controlled purchasing, payroll, shipping, and internal review. The exact functions you'd want to control if you were trying to move money without anyone noticing. One cold Saturday morning, I drove out to the storage facility the logistics relative kept billing us for. I told my husband I was running errands. I told myself I just needed to see it with my own eyes so the questions in my head would finally quiet down. There was no warehouse. There was a cracked chain-link fence, weeds pushing up through gravel that hadn't been maintained in years, and one rusted loading sign leaning sideways behind an empty strip mall. I sat in my car with the heater running, staring at a lot our company had paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to use, according to invoices signed and approved through channels I'd helped build. I didn't tell my husband where I'd been that morning. I told him I'd stopped for groceries and he didn't ask any follow-up questions, which in itself felt like something worth noting. For years, he'd always asked about my errands, small talk that felt like affection at the time. That morning, he just nodded and went back to the paper. That night, I lay awake running numbers in my head, the kind of arithmetic that doesn't need a calculator so much as it needs you to finally admit what you already know. If that storage bill had been fake for even 2 years, the total would already run into 6 figures. If it had been fake the whole time the logistics relative had held the account, the number climbed into territory that made my stomach turn over. I didn't confront anyone yet. I told myself I needed more than one empty lot before I brought this to my father, before I risked tearing apart a family, even a family that had started to feel less like mine with every passing month. Looking back, I recognize that hesitation for what it actually was, not caution, fear of being wrong, and a deeper fear of being right. That was the morning fear replaced doubt, and it never really went back. I hired a forensic accountant about 2 weeks after that Saturday morning, paying her out of my own personal funds so there would be no trace of the arrangement anywhere near company records. We met at a coffee shop outside the city, one with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, somewhere I was confident nobody from work would recognize either of us. She never promised me a scandal in that first meeting. She only promised to follow the money wherever it led, and she said it in a flat, professional tone that I found more reassuring than any sympathy would have been. 3 months later, she showed me a list of connected vendors, repeated payments, and approval chains that always, without exception, led back to the same small circle of names. There was also one internal access account that appeared in the system logs every single time a questionable payment moved forward toward final approval. No employee name attached to it directly, no department listed, just an authorization level high enough to see everything that passed through the financial system, and the timing of its activity always lined up a little too neatly with the moments I'd started asking questions. I didn't know yet whose login that was. I want to be honest that at this point in the story, I assumed it belonged to someone in finance, maybe someone my mother-in-law had placed there specifically to monitor the books on her behalf. I didn't let myself consider the other possibility yet. Some doors you keep closed for as long as you possibly can, because you already sense what's behind them. I needed to know whether my husband was simply protecting his family out of some warped sense of loyalty, or whether he was actively helping them move money out from under my father's company. So I did something I'm not proud of, though I've made my peace with it since. I lied to him. I mentioned, casually over dinner one night, a fake audit of a department we'd never actually reviewed before, something in receiving that I said would be checked first thing Monday morning. I watched his face when I said it. Nothing moved. He nodded, asked a follow-up question about scheduling, and we finished dinner like it was any other Tuesday. Within hours that same evening, the cousin tried to access those exact records from his home computer. I know this because the accountant had already flagged his account for monitoring, anticipating exactly this kind of reaction. When I confronted my husband the next morning, he did not deny warning them. I remember exactly where we were standing, in our bedroom, morning light coming through the blinds and stripes across the carpet. He looked at me and said, "Your family has more than enough. Why should mine get nothing?" Something inside me went very still after that. Not angry, not yet, just still, the way a room goes still right before a storm actually arrives. When the air pressure changes but the rain hasn't started falling, I stopped stopped trying to save my marriage that day. I started quietly and deliberately, preparing to save my father's company instead. I moved into a small rental house 3 weeks before the divorce was finalized. It was clean and painfully quiet in a way our old house never had been. Half-open boxes lined the living room for weeks because I couldn't bring myself to finish unpacking. Like finishing would make the whole situation permanent in a way I wasn't ready for. One coffee mug sat by the sink, not the chipped blue one, just an ordinary white one I'd bought at a grocery store the week I moved in. At night, the heater clicked on and off at odd intervals, and I'd lie there replaying every conversation my husband had ever managed to turn around on me, every apology I'd offered for noticing something true. My gray blazer hung from the bedroom door the entire time. Every single morning, I saw it before I saw myself in the mirror behind it. The accountant finished her investigation 11 months after our first meeting at that coffee shop. She called on a Tuesday afternoon and asked me to come alone. No exceptions. At the coffee shop, she'd chosen a table near the window this time, the same general area where I'd once sat with my back to the door, afraid someone might recognize me and ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. This time I made a point of facing the entrance instead. The accountant placed a single folder on the table between us. 27 employees are connected to your husband's family, she said, sliding it toward me. But they didn't all play the same role in this. She walked me through the pattern piece by piece. A smaller core group controlled purchasing, shipping, payroll, and internal review. The same 4 functions I'd already started to suspect on my own. Bills had been inflated steadily over years. Payments had been split deliberately to avoid triggering secondary approval. Contracts had been steered again and again toward businesses tied to my mother-in-law through ownership structures that took real digging to uncover. The fake storage site alone, the one with the cracked dents and the leaning sign, had charged the company for years without a single day of actual use. The total losses across everything the accountant had traced came to just under $4 million. I sat with that number for a long moment. $4 million moved slowly enough and carefully enough that it had taken me years just to notice the shape of it, let alone the scale. "There's one more thing," the accountant said, and something in her voice made me sit up straighter. She turned to a page near the back of the folder, tapping it once with her finger. "This access account, the one that always opens right before a flagged payment clears." I nodded. I'd been waiting for this part since she first mentioned it months earlier. "We traced it," she said. "It's not finance. It's not anyone in the departments my mother-in-law placed people in." My mouth went dry. "Then whose is it?" She didn't answer right away. She closed the folder for a second, like she needed a moment to decide how to say the next part, then opened it again to the same page. I could hear the hum of the espresso machine behind the counter, someone laughing at a table near the door, all of it strangely loud in the silence between her question and mine. The accountant looked at me steadily, the way you look at someone right before you tell them something you know is going to change the shape of their life. "It's your husband's." I didn't say anything for a long moment. My husband's login. Not the cousins, not the logistics relatives, not some distant relation working nights in accounting. His own access, opening the exact records that would have exposed everything, every single time I got close enough to see it clearly. He wasn't approving the payments himself, the accountant said, watching my face carefully. He was doing something quieter, watching the reviews, tracking your questions, warning his family the moment you got too close to something that mattered. I thought about every night he'd rubbed my shoulders at that kitchen table, every time he'd told me I was exhausted, that I was seeing patterns because I was looking too hard. He hadn't just been dismissing me out of some misguided sense of family loyalty. He'd been running interference in real time, using information I'd handed him myself, across years of conversations I thought were private between a husband and a wife. I drove home that night and sat in my car in the driveway for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. My attorney helped me build out the next steps carefully and deliberately over the following weeks. We preserved every record the accountant had gathered. We separated my personal finances from anything jointly held. We prepared a lawful, methodical response for every one of the 27 employees involved because I'd already decided, somewhere in those early weeks, that no one would be punished simply for sharing a last name with my mother-in-law. But no one would be allowed to erase evidence either. And that line mattered to me more than almost anything else in the entire process. So I waited. I signed the divorce papers, while my husband told mutual friends that I'd become cold and obsessed with work. A narrative I only heard about secondhand from people who felt awkward repeating it to me. My mother-in-law sent a handful of messages about forgiveness and family and moving forward, all of which I read and none of which I answered. The cousin, oddly, suddenly requested access to old vendor records he'd never needed before, a request that told me almost everything I needed to know about what he suspected was coming. The morning the judge finalized the divorce, I wore the gray blazer my father had given me years earlier. Outside the courthouse, cold wind pushed against the folder of documents I carried, the one with the accountant's findings, my attorney's legal preparations, and a single sheet listing all 27 names in the order my mother-in-law had introduced them to me over 8 years. I called my father before I lost my nerve. "Dad, I need you to lock out all 27 employees my in-laws planted in the company." Silence on the line, longer than I expected. Then I told him everything. The fake warehouse with its cracked fence and leaning sign, the inflated bills, the split payments, my husband's account, opening records at exactly the moments that mattered. Nearly $4 million gone over 6 years, moved slowly enough that it had taken me most of that time just to see the outline of it. "I recommended some of them myself," I said, my voice finally breaking on that sentence in a way it hadn't broken on anything else that whole morning. "This happened because you trusted me." My father breathed out slowly on the other end of the line. "You trusted the wrong people." he said. That is not the same thing as betraying me. My eyes burned. I looked up at the gray sky over the courthouse steps and tried to hold everything together for just a few more seconds. Send me the evidence, I told my attorney, who was standing a few feet away waiting for exactly that instruction. Within minutes, my attorney, human resources, and outside counsel joined a secure call together. By noon, access had been suspended for all 27 individuals, pending individual review. Unfinished payments were frozen mid-process. Records were backed up in triplicate. Each person received notice of administrative leave along with a clear explanation of their right to respond. At 2:17 that afternoon, according to the system logs the accountant pulled that evening, the cousin tried to sign into the network remotely from his home computer. At 2:24, the logistics relative told a junior employee to move a set of shipping records off-site before anyone could review them. At 2:31, my husband called a supervisor directly and asked, in a voice the supervisor later described as unusually calm, whether the system was still accessible from outside the building. Thank God I had made that call from the courthouse steps when I did, instead of waiting even one more day to gather my courage. That evening, I was unpacking plates into a cabinet in my small rental kitchen when someone started pounding on my front door hard enough that I felt it through the floor. Through the peephole, I saw my mother-in-law standing on my porch under the yellow light, and the first thing she shouted, loud enough that my neighbor's porch light clicked on through the shared wall, wasn't a question about what I'd found. It was a question about how much I'd managed to save. You have no idea what you've done, my mother-in-law said the moment I opened the door, not bothering with any greeting at all. You locked out 27 people. 27 families are under review right now because of you. Don't play games with me. Her finger lifted toward my face, something she'd never done before in 8 years of careful, indirect requests. You will restore their access tonight. You will stop this ridiculous investigation, and you will call my husband before you destroy what's left of your marriage. My marriage ended this morning, I said. That can be fixed. No. The word came out quiet, quieter than I expected it to, and that seemed to frighten her far more than if I'd raised my voice to match hers. My mother-in-law's expression shifted after that quiet no, the anger draining out of her face and something softer, more practiced, sliding into its place. Her shoulders dropped. Her voice lowered into a register I recognized from years of Thanksgiving dinners and birthday calls. He still loves you, she said. He made mistakes. We all did. But families handle things privately. You mean quietly, I said. I mean with loyalty. I looked at the woman who had spent 8 years wrapping every single request in that word, starting with a bowl of sweet potatoes and a mention of the cousin's layoff, all the way up to this moment on my own front porch. No one is being punished for being related to you, I told her. Each person will be reviewed based on what they actually did. You have nothing here. We have the payment history. We have the records. And some of your people are already cooperating, faster than you'd probably like to know. For just a second, her face went completely blank, the way a screen goes blank between one image and the next. Then she smiled, small and cold, an expression I'd never once seen on her in 8 years of dinners and holidays. You think they'll choose you over blood? They're choosing themselves, I said. She stared at me for a long moment, and I finally understood, standing there in my doorway with a cold coming in around us both, why she'd driven over in person instead of calling or sending someone else. She wasn't there to argue about fairness, or even really to defend anyone's job. She was there to find out exactly who had already started talking, so she'd know how much time she had left to control the story. That's when she said something that struck me as odd, even in the middle of everything else. You think you found all of it, she said, almost to herself, glancing past me into the house like she was checking whether my husband might somehow be inside. You think 27 is the whole number? I didn't answer her right away. At the time, I assumed she was simply trying to rattle me, to plant doubt the way she'd planted people in my father's company for 8 straight years. I filed the comment away without giving it the weight it deserved, mostly because I was exhausted and cold and just wanted her off my porch. You need to leave, I told her. This is not over. No, I said, half to myself as I stepped back inside. It's finally starting. 3 days later, we met in the main conference room at the plant, the same room where I'd once presented quarterly numbers to my father with a kind of nervous pride I hadn't felt in years. The accountant sat beside my attorney with stacks of records arranged carefully in front of them. My father took the chair at the end of the table, the chipped blue mug sitting untouched beside his folder. I sat to his right in the gray blazer. The cousin arrived with an attorney of his own. The logistics relative came alone, jaw tight. My husband entered last and would not look at me once, not through the entire opening portion of the meeting. The accountant began with the storage site, laying out the bills, the payments, and photographs of the empty lot with its cracked fence and leaning sign. Then came the inflated vendor contracts, the consulting charges with no work attached. The payments split deliberately into amounts small enough to avoid a second layer of review. The cousin leaned forward almost immediately. He handled logistics, he said, nodding toward the man beside him, like the words had been sitting ready in his mouth for days. The logistics relative snapped back without missing a beat. You approved every vendor we used. I approved what your department submitted to me. You told us which ones to use. Their voices climbed over each other for almost a full minute until my attorney raised one hand, palm out, and the room went quiet again. 2 junior employees were brought in separately after that, one at a time, and both gave nearly identical accounts. The cousin had told them to divide bills into smaller amounts. The logistics relative had told them to remove storage references from routine reviews before those reviews ever reached me. My mother-in-law's name had never once appeared in writing across any of it, careful as always, but her businesses had received the money, invoice after invoice, for years. My husband stayed silent through most of this, arms crossed, eyes fixed somewhere on the table in front of him, until the accountant pulled up his access history on the screen at the end of the room. Every time you raised a concern, the accountant said. His account opened the same records within hours, sometimes within minutes. My attorney turned toward him directly. Did you share internal information with your mother or her relatives? My husband rubbed both hands slowly over his face before he answered. I warned them she was asking questions, he said. Why? They said she was trying to push them out. I looked at him across that long table, the same table where I used to bring him coffee during late meetings, back when I still believed we were building something together instead of one of us quietly dismantling it. Did you ever choose me? I asked. When choosing me actually cost you something? His mouth opened. Nothing came out. That silence hurt more than any excuse would have, more than I expected silence alone could hurt. A week after that meeting, my mother-in-law's attorney sent a letter threatening a wrongful termination lawsuit, along with public claims of discrimination against the 27 employees under review. My attorney responded within 48 hours with a summary of the evidence and a single simple statement. If my mother-in-law filed anything, the company would provide the preserved records, the witness statements, the payment trails, and the related contracts to the court, and would cooperate fully with any lawful review that followed. The threat disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. By then, the cousin had stopped blaming the logistics relative for anything. The logistics relative had stopped blaming the junior staff. My husband had stopped calling my father's office to ask about the status of the investigation, something he'd done twice in the first week without success. And my mother-in-law had lost, one by one, the three things she had always used to control the people around her: access, silence, fear. For the first time since I'd known her, sitting across a conference table watching her carefully built structure come apart in real time, my mother-in-law had nothing left to demand from anyone. The investigation stretched on for 9 more weeks after that first meeting. 19 employees were ultimately terminated for approving false bills, hiding conflicts of interest, moving records without authorization, or directly benefiting from the scheme in ways that were impossible to explain innocently. 4 resigned before their individual interviews were even complete, choosing to leave rather than sit across from my attorney and answer questions under oath. 4 others stayed because the evidence showed clearly that they hadn't taken any money themselves and had cooperated fully the moment they understood what was actually happening around them. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected it to going in. I had spent months genuinely afraid that protecting the company would turn me into someone who punished people simply for sharing a last name with my mother-in-law, the exact kind of guilt by association reasoning she'd used on me for years to get what she wanted. It didn't happen that way. We followed the facts, one person at a time, and let the facts decide. The cousin and the logistics relative both faced civil claims for a portion of the losses. My mother-in-law's storage business, the one behind the cracked fence and the leaning sign, closed its doors before the end of that year, though shutting down didn't erase the payment history my attorney had already preserved in triplicate months earlier. My father refused, throughout all of it, to turn the case into any kind of public spectacle. He did make one thing clear to everyone involved, though, in a tone I'd rarely heard him use. If anyone with actual authority asks for these records, he said, they get everything, no exceptions. My husband called me once during those 9 weeks. It was late, rain tapping steadily against the kitchen window of my rental house, and his name appeared on my phone screen glowing in the dark for several seconds before I made myself answer it. Did you ever believe I loved you? He asked, his voice sounding smaller than I remembered it, smaller than it had sounded in years. I closed my eyes. Yes, I said. I believe you loved me. You just needed your mother's approval more than you ever needed to protect our marriage. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'm sorry. I had imagined hearing those 2 words from him for months by that point. When they finally came, they didn't heal anything the way I'd once thought they might, but they did set something loose in my chest that had been clenched tight for a very long time. The company didn't recover overnight, and I'm not going to pretend it did. The first month after the terminations was genuinely messy. Late meetings stacked on top of each other, temporary managers learning departments they'd never touched before, people doing 2 jobs at once while a new hire worked to rebuild purchasing and shipping from close to nothing. Then slowly, the numbers began to shift. Deliveries stabilized. Longtime employees who'd been passed over for years finally got promoted into the roles they'd earned. Competitive bids replaced the private favors that had quietly bled the company for the better part of a decade. Within several months, vendor costs had dropped by roughly 20%. Nearly a year after the lockout, we posted our strongest quarterly results in years, numbers my father hadn't seen since well before my husband and I ever met. That spring, my father gathered everyone on the factory floor, the air smelling like machine oil and hot steel the way it always had since I was a kid, trailing behind him on weekends. The same chipped blue mug sat on a folding table beside him. I wore the gray blazer, same as I had on the courthouse steps, same as I had at every meeting since. My father told the employees gathered there that trust had been abused badly, but that the people who'd truly built the business had also protected it when it mattered most. Then he announced that I'd be taking over as president. Applause rolled across the factory floor, echoing off the high metal ceiling. I looked down at my own hands and found them steady, steadier than they'd been in months. I thought, standing there, that this was the end of the story. My mother-in-law had lost access to something that was never really hers to control. My husband had lost a marriage he'd refused to defend when it mattered. I had finally stopped confusing silence with love, a confusion that had cost me years I couldn't get back. I was wrong about it being the end, I just didn't know that yet. It was the new hire rebuilding purchasing and shipping who found it, almost by accident, about 10 months after the terminations. He'd been cleaning up old vendor files as part of a routine system migration, moving years of records into a newer database so the whole department could finally leave behind the patchwork of spreadsheets the cousin and the logistics relative had left behind them. He came to my office on a Thursday afternoon holding a single printed page, his expression careful in a way that told me immediately this wasn't a routine question about the migration. "I found a payroll account," he said, "that doesn't match anything in the 27 names from the investigation. It's been dormant for months, since right around the lockout, but the historical activity goes back years." I felt something cold move through my chest before he'd even finished the sentence. I thought immediately of my mother-in-law standing on my porch that first night, glancing past me into the house, saying, "You think 27 is the whole number," in that strange, almost distracted tone I'd filed away and mostly forgotten. "Whose name is on it?" I asked. The new hire slid the page across my desk. "That's the strange part. The account is registered under a variation of your name, your married surname added onto your maiden name, not the version that's actually on your employee records. It was set up as a consultant account, structured to look like reimbursements routed through your existing employee ID, just close enough to pass a quick glance." I stared at the page for a long moment before I could make myself speak. "I never authorized a consulting account. I didn't think you had," the new hire said quietly, "which is why I brought it to you directly, instead of routing it through the normal channels. I called the accountant that same afternoon, and she came in the next morning to pull the full history herself. What she found took another 2 weeks to fully untangle, but the shape of it became clear faster than that. The account had been opened 4 years into my marriage, right around the time my mother-in-law's 4th or 5th placement had settled into internal review. It had received small, irregular payments over the following years, timed in a way that made them nearly invisible against the backdrop of my actual salary, and the 27 other flagged connections everyone had already spent months investigating. The payments hadn't gone to my mother-in-law, or to the cousin, or to the logistics relative, or to any of the 27 names I'd already spent a year of my life dismantling piece by piece. They had gone to my husband, not through his own accounts, which the accountant had already combed through thoroughly during the original investigation. Through this one, dressed up to look like it belonged to me, so that if anyone ever traced the money far enough to notice it at all, the first name they'd find would be mine. I sat with that for a long time after the accountant explained it, longer than I'd sat with almost anything else across the entire ordeal. The 27 employees, the fake storage site, the split bills and inflated contracts, all of it had been real, and all of it had genuinely cost the company nearly $4 million over 6 years. But underneath that entire visible structure, there had been a second, quieter mechanism running the whole time, one built specifically to survive an investigation into the first, because it had been designed from the start to look like it belonged to me. My husband hadn't just been protecting his family by warning them when I got close. He'd built himself an exit, a version of events where, if everything ever came apart, the paper trail would point first at his wife, buying him time, buying him distance, buying him deniability, dressed up as loyalty to a family that had never once, in 8 years, protected him the way he'd protected them. I thought about the night he'd asked me, over the phone in the rain, whether I'd ever believed he loved me. I thought about how small his voice had sounded. I understood, sitting in my office with the new hire's printed page still on my desk, that the smallness in his voice that night hadn't been shame at getting caught helping his family. It had been the particular specific fear of someone who knew there was still one more thing buried that hadn't surfaced yet, and who'd been waiting every single day since to find out whether it ever would. My mother-in-law's comment on my porch that first night hadn't been an idle attempt to rattle me. It had been a warning she couldn't stop herself from giving, even in the middle of demanding I restore everyone's access. Some part of her, I think, actually wanted me to find it. Some part of her had spent 8 years watching her son build his own quiet insurance policy against her, using my name as the cover, and she'd never once told me, because telling me would have meant giving up whatever leverage she still held over both of us. My attorney and I decided together that this discovery couldn't stay quiet, the way the original 27 had been handled internally for years before I found them. This was different. This was a fraudulent account built specifically to impersonate me inside my own father's company, and it needed to be addressed formally, on the record, with counsel present on both sides. We arranged a meeting for the following week, in a small conference room at my attorney's office, rather than the plant, somewhere neutral. My husband arrived with a lawyer I didn't recognize, someone younger than his usual circle, and I understood immediately that his mother hadn't recommended this one. He looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him, at the meeting where he'd stayed silent while the accountant pulled up his access history on the screen. The accountant laid out the account history first, methodically, the same way she'd laid out everything else across the past year, the dates, the payment structure, the way the account had been built to mirror my employee ID closely enough to survive a casual glance, but not closely enough to survive an actual audit. My husband's attorney tried briefly to suggest the account might have been set up by someone else entirely, one of the 27 perhaps working independently. The accountant didn't argue with him. She simply turned her laptop around and showed the login history tied to the account's original creation 4 years back, time-stamped and tied to a device that had, at the time, belonged only to him. He didn't fight it after that. I watched something in his shoulders give way, the same way it had given way at the first meeting, except this time there was no version of the story left for him to hide behind. "I want to know why," I said, not loudly. I didn't have any loud left in me by that point in the process. "Not the excuse you gave your mother's lawyer. The real reason." He looked at me for a long moment, longer than he'd looked at me in months. "Because I knew, eventually, it would all come apart," he said. "I knew you'd find them. I didn't know when, but I knew. And I needed something that would make it look look like it was you, if it ever went far enough that someone outside the family started asking real questions. So you built a fake version of me, I said, to protect yourself from a mess your own family made. Yes. I sat with that word for a moment, a single, flat honesty of it landing harder than any of his previous excuses ever had. 8 years of watching him smooth the shoulders of my jackets and tell me I looked like someone people would trust, and the whole time some part of him had already been quietly preparing a version of events where that trust would be the thing that broke first, not him. Did you ever, even once, I asked, think about what that would have done to me if it had gone further, if someone outside this room had found that account before I did? He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I told myself it would never come to that, but you built it anyway. I built it anyway. I stood up from the table before anyone could say anything else, before my attorney could lay out the next legal steps, before his attorney could try to negotiate some quieter resolution the way my mother-in-law's attorney had tried weeks earlier and failed. I picked up my folder, the same kind of folder I'd carried onto the courthouse steps the morning the divorce was finalized, and I looked at my husband one last time across that small conference table. I wore this blazer the day I called my father to lock you all out, I said. I didn't know yet that you'd built a version of me to hide behind. I know now. I walked out of that conference room without waiting for a response, and I didn't look back to see his face when I closed the door behind me.